Hello, fellow book lovers, both readers and writers. I am Matty Dalrymple. I write the Ann Kinnear suspense novels and suspense shorts in the Lizzie Ballard thrillers. And I also write, speak, podcast, and consult on the writing craft and the publishing voyage as the Indy Author. And this is my video series, What I Learned, where I ask authors 2 questions related to their latest book. What did they learn from that book that they would like to share with their fellow writers? And what did they learn from their latest book that they would like to share with their fellow readers? And I am here today with Frank Zafiro. Hey, Frank, how are you doing?
How are you, Matty?
I'm doing great, thank you. To give our viewers a little bit of background on you, Frank Zafiro writes gritty crime fiction for both sides of the badge. He's a retired police officer, and in fact, he was my guest on the Indy Author podcast to discuss mistakes writers make about police roles and how to avoid them. And his latest book is All the Forgotten Yesterdays. And so today I am asking Frank the 2 What I Learned questions about All the Forgotten Yesterdays, starting with what did you learn that you would like to share with your fellow writers?
Well, I think the lesson I learned was a lesson I learned actually before I even started writing the book. And that is that a negative review can be an inspiration. And to give you the short version of what happened, I came across I think it was a 3-star review on my first River City book. This current one is the 14th, Under Raging Moon. And the review was not a bad review, which I would say is a review that just isn't accurate at all. I mean, it might not even be about your book, or it just does, worst book ever. These are bad reviews. They don't do anybody any good. But a negative review can, say negative things, critical things about your book, but it's thoughtful, it's considered, it informs the person reading the review as to whether they might want to try this book or stay away from it. And this negative review was written by someone who actually was complimentary of the writing itself, but took issue with plot points, and not from a plot hole standpoint, but it was a police procedural, of course. And the issue they took was with the things the police did, many of which were, I think, incorrectly labeled. I mean, they talked about profiling, and what was going on was not profiling, but I could understand why they would, fall into thinking it was. But so I read through that, and, it was one of those things where, well, this person's not very pro-police, but at least they're honest about what they're thinking, and their opinions are sound and logical internally. They're not just, cuckoo or anything. And then I got to the final piece of critical statements that this reviewer made, and they took issue with the climactic event of the book. Now, I don't necessarily want to give it away, but it involves a clash between the main antagonist and one of the police protagonists. The River City series is kind of an ensemble cast, so it's not always the same main character. Sometimes it's the main, and then some secondary ones get a fair amount of screen time as well. And this reviewer said essentially that wasn't justice, that wasn't legal, that was basically murder. And it stopped me in my tracks when I read that, because I wrote this book in 1995 as a 2-year officer. It kind of sat on the shelf for a few years till I came back around to writing fiction again in the 2003, 2004 timeframe. And by that time, the bones of that first draft are still what are in the book that was eventually published. And so at that time, I kind of looked at all the events of the book more as almost historical, as opposed to through a critical creation eye, like you do with a work in progress. And so I never really framed the events any other way than the way that the characters framed them. But when this review came out, I looked at it, and I kind of sat back, and I took a look at the situation, you know, through what I hoped were close to the reviewer's eyes. And I realized, taken from a certain point of view, that's not an unsound argument. There's some meat on that bone. I think no one else has ever pointed it out. So I think most readers believe what happened was, justice in a fictional world. But the reviewer had a point. And again, this was a 3-star review, and it was basically 1 star for what the cops did in this book, 4 or 5 stars for the writing of it, that was well executed. And I had to admire this person for taking the time to write a review that was thought out and logical, and made their point, rather than just, the 2 or 3 words that you're lucky to get when you get a 1-star review that people might give. And it got me thinking, it really got me reframing that event a bit. And again, I wrote it in 1995. It was published in 2006. This was 20, a year ago. So quite a lot of time had passed. And ultimately, I took that realization and that thought process, and I worked it into all the forgotten yesterdays. And in the book, one of Katie's investigations take her to a very interesting place, and she confronts someone that is not very well liked in the series at all. And this person that she confronts fires back at her about her hero, who is the protagonist that was involved in that first book event that the reviewer took issue with. And he reframes it in essentially the same way that the reviewer did and makes a lot of the same points. And of course, Katie is resistant to it and doesn't, doesn't accept it. But and I left it a little unresolved. It'll be something that'll play out over the next 2 or 3 books while she can't get that bug out of her ear, and particularly as her perspective changes because her job changes. And so, the lesson I learned was that someone can be critical of your work and make a good point, and there's no reason why you can't embrace it. I mean, that was the climactic event of the first book. It was the big moment, and it was, and so there's some sanctity to that in most cases, right? But I, somebody reframed it, and they had a good point. They made a good point with their reframing. And so instead of getting, frustrated, mad, ignore it, I decided to embrace it and use it. And it's going to have ultimately a fair amount of, impact on the series art, over the course of 2 or 3 books.
That's so fascinating. Do you know if do you have any indication that would clue you in on whether the person who wrote that review has continued to follow you or read your books and would maybe like happen upon this video? It would be super fun for that person, I think, to see this video.
Yeah, that would be awesome. It would be awesome for him to just read the book and go, you know, the weird thing, the Amazon algorithm is strange with reviews, as you well know.
Yeah.
And I went back and tried to find the review, because I ruminated on this. Well, first I simmered on it
Yeah.
briefly.
Yeah.
And then I was like, wait a minute, this is just like any other feedback. Like if I gave you my book and said, tell me what you think of this draft, why am I getting mad? Or I wasn't mad, but why am I being negative about it? And so there was quite a lot of time that had passed before I was like, I'm going to go back and make sure I'm getting all the points the person made. If I'm going to use this, let's use it. And I could not find the review again when I went through looking for it. And I went way back, because I thought maybe I just didn't notice it and it was a much older review or something like that. And I could not find it. I'm going to make another attempt in case it's popped back up, because I would be curious if, did they pick up that first book? They read it through to the end, obviously. They liked the writing. They just didn't like the events. I mean, that's a candidate for somebody who might continue with the series. And I'm biased, of course, but I would like to think that maybe they would come around a little bit on some of the characters because of the things that happen to them and the choices that they make. They're essentially noble, admirable people. They just make mistakes. But to see a video like this and go, yeah, I'm going to shoot him an email because that was me.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
where's my royalty check?
Well, I think that we sort of touched on this idea of accepting input on one's work in some of our earlier conversations. And Frank, I think you're sort of like the poster child for the healthy way of handling it. Like, as you said, you had to simmer on it for a little bit, but I do think it's sort of generalizing. It's a good lesson for writers to learn that if someone says, hate the book, I didn't even read it, then you can just ignore them, because that says more about the writer of the review than it does the writer of the book. But that if you can bring yourself to look for those negative reviews that are thoughtful, as you're describing, they can
Yeah,
be
I
a
mean,
valuable learning experience.
you're so right. You're so right. And there are trolls out there that, I have a friend who's got somebody out there who just like almost like a vulture just waits to swoop in and leave a 1-star review with a pithy, useless comment. And especially when the book first comes out, if there aren't many reviews, it really tanks the overall star rating. But
Yeah.
Kevin Tipple is an independent reviewer, and he's the one who got me thinking in terms of the difference between a negative review and a bad review. And he described it the way, I described how he described it. Bad review is just they say bad things and there's no substance to it, or they say nothing. But a negative review can still be a positive experience for definitely the reader you know, just because I leave a negative review for something, oh, there's too much fishing in this book. Well, maybe you love fishing,
Yeah.
so that
Well, I do think the review you're describing is a perfect example of that because I can imagine a lot of people reading that review and saying, "Oh, that's really interesting. I want to read that scene and I want to think for myself about,
yeah,
my own interpretation of it." Or, if someone says too much sex in the book, then you're going to sell a whole bunch of books to people who
yeah,
are looking for books with a lot
yeah.
of sex.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. That's so
exactly,
fascinating.
and, anybody who says they don't read the reviews, I've said it before, they're lying.
Yeah.
Everybody does.
Yeah.
But, I think the point that I take from what you said and that I try to employ is you're looking for trends. If you're getting a lot of low reviews and people are mentioning a certain element, well, you may have blown that element and, I guess you could pull the book and fix it, but more to the point, in your next book, you're going to make sure not to make that same mistake. And the same is true with positive stuff. If people are loving your characters, then you can, kind of rest assured that you've written some vibrant characters, and you want to keep doing what you're doing.
Yeah. I had the example of that for me is my first book, The Sense of Death, had a sweary character in it, and when I wrote it, I had no idea who I was writing it for, but I saw that the trend in my reviews was a lot of people said, "I really liked the book, but, yeah, I thought there was excessive profanity." And I went back and I looked, and I was like, they're kinda right, like, he doesn't have to swear quite that much. And I think I reduced the dropping of the F-bomb from, like, 17 to 9 or something like that with no lots of, like, creative control over the situation. But the other thing I'm thinking of that is, I think a good tip for writers is I wouldn't just happen upon bad reviews. Like, I often go and look for good reviews if I'm doing like ads and I'm looking for pull quotes from good reviews. And that's always fun. You go look for the 5-star ones and you pat yourself on the back. But I think that it's better if you're going to be looking at reviews across the board to look for those kind of trends that you're talking about, then it's kind of nice to go into it intentionally and knowing that you're kind of in a place where you can read those things with the sort of frame of mind that you're describing, not just like accidentally see them and maybe you're not in a mental place where you should be reading that kind of thing at the moment.
I actually have a funny story about swearing, and you can cut this out. It'd probably make us go too long. But when I wrote Under a Raging Moon, I tried to be very clear or very true to dialogue. And dialogue is what has always been one of my strengths. And so I wrote the way cops talk, and spoiler alert, but they talk like sailors. And so a lot of the early readers, both professional and just lay people, commented on that. Wow, there's a lot of swearing here. There's too much swearing in here. And I resisted it at first, but ultimately I thought, they've got a point here. And so I went through and I culled out probably 70% of the profanity and actually probably close to 90% if you include softening some of the terms and either cutting them out entirely, making them not profanity, or softening them, or just saying, Maddie cursed into her hand, quietly or something, So the book is published and it's out there. Some years later, I got another, I guess, negative review, maybe a bad review. I don't know. You decide. Where the person wrote, too much swearing in this book, every other word. And yes, I don't care if you think that's how cops really talk. I just I had to laugh because on 2 points, I mean, I think I know how cops actually talk was the biggest one, but then I remembered how much I cut out. So,
Yeah, if they had
swearing
read
is
the earlier
interesting.
one. Yeah.
Yeah, their head would have exploded.
Well, I think that's another good the more we talk, the more I'm thinking this is turning into a podcast episode because I think the information you're sharing about, what writers can learn is so great. And the other thing I'm realizing, apropos of dialogue, is that realistic dialogue isn't necessarily and I'm not suggesting that you're suggesting it is, but it's not necessarily you turn on the recorder, you record, the room full of cops or whatever, and then you transcribe it, that, you know, you might have a conversation where in reality it would be perfectly reasonable for those characters to drop 17 F-bombs, but you only need a couple to sort of convey the gestalt of the situation.
Yeah, it's like spice, really. I mean, if you put
Yeah,
too much pepper, that all you taste is the pepper, right?
yeah.
And so, and you're right. I mean, dialogue is meant to be an approximation of how people really talk. It's much more concise, and characters don't interrupt each other nearly as much as we do in real life, and there's more direction to dialogue in fiction, whereas people wander in real life and they go off on tangents and leave the path of the intended discussion and so forth. So you make a great point. You make an excellent point there.
Yeah, what I find in subsequent sweeps through my books on edits is that I'll often have I'll shorten up the back and forth. So in a early draft, I might have, "I'm going to the store. Why are you doing that?" "Because I need to talk to Joe." And then it will become, "I'm going to the store because I need to talk to Joe," because the back and forth is just, might it be realistic? Sure, but is it worth the extra line? Probably not.
Sure.
It's, it's choppier than it
Yeah.
needs to be, or it's more obtuse than it needs to be, or something like that.
I wish I did that better. That's one that I've noticed when other people edit my work, whether it's an editor for a short story that they're publishing in an anthology or something, or whatever. Those are the corrections that sometimes get made, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's tighter. 9 out
Yeah.
of 10 times I like it better. Um, there are times where you want that response because you're slipping something in with it, either a characterization or a little bit of plot point there that or red herring or something. But 9 out of 10 times I think it's tighter. So I'm glad you're on it because I'm certainly not.
Well, let's address the other question, the other what I
Okay.
learned question, which is, what did you learn from all the forgotten yesterdays that you would like to share with your fellow readers?
For the reader lesson that I learned, I think it's about allowing a long running series to evolve, to breathe, that characters can come and go, if it's an ensemble cast especially, but even if it's a main character thing, uh, then a lot of the secondary characters could be the ones to come and go. And the main character of this book is, no surprise, Katie McLeod. She's been a central character to the series since, well, for the entire series, but certainly by the third book, she became the core character. But as time has gone on, I've tried to give some oxygen to other characters, some page time, explore a few other stories, and go down a few side streets while still having her as the main character most of the time. And what I've come to realize is, life never is, it's never static. It always changes. And so Katie is experiencing changes. She's gone from being a patrol officer on graveyard to a day shift officer to becoming a detective to becoming a major crimes detective. And when this book opens, she's taken the exam for promotion to sergeant. And so, and she's gone from being, involved with a fellow police officer to being kind of serially single to being involved in a steady relationship for several years with an emergency room doctor. And these are all changes. And if you think about it, those don't sound like radical changes in a real person's life. I mean, that sounds like what happened to somebody over a decade or a decade and a half. But I realized as time has gone on that, Katie's role will diminish somewhat in the coming books. Not go away, and not for a couple of books. But as her career progresses, she's going to be in some positions where if I would be making one of those mistakes that we talked about on a previous podcast together by having her do things in that role that people in that role don't do. She won't be a detective anymore. So having her go out and solve crimes doesn't make sense. And so it's time for the next, generation, if you will, to step into that role and to have some face time and to get some time as the main or core characters as we move on. And as this series has progressed, people have retired, people have died, people have left the job for other reasons than retirement. Things have changed. And the one thing I've never really let change up till recently is I've clung to Katie because she's my favorite character. She's the core character. And it's hard to think about letting her become a secondary or tertiary character. And we're talking 7, 8 books from now when we get to the tertiary stage, but still, I mean, it's difficult emotionally, but I think it's true to the series. I mean, it's an ensemble series and people's roles change and who's doing what changes. And I think I need to stay true to that. So, for instance, in the previous book that Katie was in, The Worst Kind of Truth, it was 100% from her point of view, third person, but from her point of view. That was book 11. And book 12 was a different book entirely. It was all about Tom Chisholm. It was away from the main River City storyline. And then 13 was a short story collection in which I don't think Kitty was even in any of the stories. So this book 14 is really the first novel that's back to the mainline events. And in this book, she's probably 70% of the main perspective, the main POV. And there's 2 or 3 characters that share the other 30%. And so this is a trend that will continue as the next several books play out. She'll probably be roughly 60, 70% for the next 2 or so, maybe 3, and then her role will diminish. She'll always have a role no matter where she is because she's Katie and she is the iconic character of the series. But that's the path that I'm presently on. And it's a difficult one. So if it's difficult for me, it might be difficult for readers who are attached to these characters as well. That's the lesson that I'm learning.
Just a quick break from the interview. Are you getting value from the podcast? Please consider supporting it and all the work I do at the Indy Author by becoming a patron. To pledge a monthly contribution, go to patreon.com/the Indy Author, or to make an occasional contribution, perhaps to indicate the value that a specific episode or resource provided to you on your creative voyage, scroll to the bottom of any page at theindyauthor.com and click Buy Me a Coffee. And now, back to the interview. Yeah, this is going to be a really interesting conversation paired with podcast episode 210 with Sarah Rosette on creating compelling series. And one of the conversations we had was about how do you make those kind of evolutions, either strictly for story reasons or because you're getting bored or because readers are getting bored or whatever. And it's interesting to hear about somebody who has such a sort of long-term view of where you're taking the series and the considerations, like a very sort of scientific step down of that character's involvement. Did you ever think about actually ending the Katie series and then officially spinning up a separate one that might be one of the other characters? Or have you always thought of it as it's a world and you're just continuing that world with a shifting cast of characters?
Yeah, the latter. It's always been, an ensemble cast was always the vision for this.
Mhm.
Initially, it was a 4-book series is all I had in mind. I had the titles and I had an arc for the 4 books, and it changed a bit as time went on, and ultimately the 4th book radically changed. Nothing except the title remained from the original concept, and the character that I drew up, early on as kind of one of the main characters, Stefan Kopriva. We talked about him on a different podcast.
Yeah.
He ended up leaving the job and this after the 2nd book, spoiler alert. And and I thought he was going to be the main character of the series, and it ultimately became Katie. And that's the interesting dichotomy in that I'm sitting here today and I have a long-term plan for the universe of River City and these characters. But at the same time, they surprised me. I mean, they surprised me in what happened with Kopriva and Katie's emergence as the core, the stuff that we talked about here with how she's viewing Chisholm differently, or at least an event that occurred with Chisholm differently because somebody reframed it. Characters that I didn't realize were going to retire or be together or, die, get killed. I mean, these things, they're still surprises no matter how much you plan. And
Yeah.
so that's kind of the fun of it is, yeah, okay, maybe this is going to happen with Katie. She's going to go into this role or that role, but there may be some surprising things that happen during that time. And other characters that are playing smaller roles now will have larger roles. I mean, it's not like I'm just going to suddenly have Dudley Do Right show up and be the main character. I mean, it's just going to be characters who already have roles will just take on slightly larger roles. And that's, to me, that's what a true ensemble show does. And if you think of NYPD Blue as an example, David Caruso was the star of that. After 2 seasons, he left. And then they brought in Jimmy Smits, and he was arguably the star of that. And then he left. And they brought in Rick Schroeder, you know, and then he and Dennis Franz kind of shared the spotlight. And then Schroeder left. By the time they brought in his last partner, Sipowicz, Dennis Franz's character, had become the main character of that
Yeah.
series and really was for the remainder of the series. And now when you go back and watch those episodes, it's hard not to watch them without an eye towards that eventual, development of him being the main character. And so that's kind of what I've always liked about the idea of an ensemble cast is it can ebb and flow and people can come and go and things can happen and surprise you and yet you can still at least have a compass direction that you're taking the series.
The Sipowicz example is a great one because that is a character that I think viewers would have had to have grown into accepting as a main character because, as I recall, he was pretty unpleasant. And it was only over time, I think he became somewhat less unpleasant, probably as the writers sort of understood the potential they had there. But also, the more you knew him, the more empathetic and sympathetic a character he became. And so that's another benefit of an ensemble cast is you have that time to both for yourself and for other people to understand the characters at a much deeper level and have the readers accept them in a way they might not have accepted them if you sort of, shove that character into the leading role right to begin with. Like, I don't know, that show would have survived if they had just teed up
No.
Sipowicz as the primary guy at the beginning.
A fat bald guy in the lead in 1993 or whatever it was. I
Yeah.
mean, I don't think so. And
And an
interestingly,
unpleasant, uh,
yeah,
bald guy
yeah.
too. Like, it
So
wasn't just his
an
appearance.
anti-hero. Mhm.
Yes, very much an anti-hero.
Yeah, NYPD Blue, now that I think about it, is really for very much the story of the redemption of Andy Sipowicz. I mean, if you look at it, it's just that he's not the main character in that story for a while, at least in terms of screen time, but that's really what it's about. And if you recall, at the end of that series, he becomes a sergeant. He moves into a leadership role. So everything changes. Right now, he's the one doing the leading and someone else is going to be doing the investigating. And so you have some of that evolution of life roles that takes place. And I've always admired that kind of storytelling in ensemble stories and have really wanted to represent it in my own series.
Yeah. Well, obviously, we've gone so far off the rails with the theoretical what I learned thing. So I'm going to ask one more question unrelated to the questions I teed up for you, which is I think a lot of people who've been writing a long time look back at their first book and hopefully they're proud of it, but maybe sometimes they think, oh, is that really the book I want to be sending readers to? Because, if you've been writing for 5, 10, 15, 20, however many years, then, your craft improves. And so one assumes that one's most recent book is better than one's first book. But when you're writing the kind of series that you're writing, where there's this overarching story arc and the evolution of the characters, you probably don't expect your readers to be dipping in and out at different points. Do you still like to send readers to the first book so they can read through in and experience the evolution of these characters in order?
It's usually my recommendation. Yeah. Any of the books can stand alone. And, and I'll tell people that, and it's true. But I think you get more impactful enjoyment out of certain scenes if the cumulative weight of the events that preceded it is present for you. A good example might be in The Worst Kind of Truth. There's a wedding near the very beginning of the book and a retirement near the end of the book. They're kind of the bookend events of of The Worst Kind of Truth. And the wedding is a culmination of a long-standing relationship that began in the shadow of a very untimely and sad death. And there's guilt associated with it. And it's just been a long time coming. And so if you read those scenes, you might pick up on what's going on and it might be like, wow, this is kind of, tense, or this is kind of a beautiful thing or whatever. But if you read the previous, 10 installments, 9 installments of the series to that point, you might be in tears. You might be crying at that wedding. I certainly very nearly was. And so I would send people back to the beginning. The danger of that is exactly what you said, Maddie, is if somebody asks me, what's your worst book craft wise? It's an easy answer. It's the first one, not only because it was the first one that was ever published, but you can still see the bones of that 1995 draft in there. And, even in 2006, I was a better writer than I was in 1995. And certainly in 2023, I hope I'm better at it. And so it's a mixed bag. You want them to start at the beginning for that sort of stick with the family and get the entire history of the family sort of experience, but you're sending them to what is arguably your weakest book in terms of writing craft. And so, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I've been tempted, like I think many writers have in this digital age. It wouldn't take much to completely rewrite the book and republish it, as if, what, this is the book, it just, that just, this is just, that just feels dishonest though. I mean, it's a product of its time. That was who I was when I wrote that book. That's who those characters were. That's how I saw them. That was the energy associated with it. And it feels untrue to go back and completely redo it, at least, and then represent it as the first book. I mean, maybe a special edition, like available only through my direct sell store or something like that, where, yeah, hey, here's an alternative universe. If I had waited another 20 years, what this book might have looked like, you know,
The question would be, do you just go through and tidy up the craft parts like a copy edit? I guess that's the question. You might look at it and say, "Oh, if I were gonna return to it, it would be like a developmental edit." And
yeah.
yet you could return to it and have it be more like a copy edit where you're applying the line by line craft improvements you've experienced, but maybe not taking down the whole structure of it.
Yeah, I think copy edit stuff, I think it's okay to return to stuff that you've written in the past and, fix outright typos or errors, or maybe, I have a proofreader who just is hell on that. She kills so many that's. I mean, she literally kills so many that I have to fight to keep some of them. I have to be very careful because occasionally that is being killed
It's an
actually
important
create
that.
yeah, it actually
Yeah.
creates a problem with the logic of the sentence. But it's a good point that we all have these ticks, and, copy editing, that's a gray area. I think it's okay to clean something up. We live in a digital age, and that's the advantage
Yeah.
of it. But a developmental edit would be something different. I've actually been toying with the idea, though. The book was out in 2006, so it'll have its 20-year anniversary here coming up in a bit. And, haven't really announced publicly yet that I'm setting up a direct sell store that'll be available in January, but I am. And that
You've
might be
heard it here
something that
first.
you actually did. It might be something that would be one of those things that's only available from that particular retailers. And it would
Exactly.
be something that I think you've got to be careful going down that rabbit hole of I'm going to go fix things because, what do they say? A piece of art is never finished. It's just released. A book is never done. It's just published.
Yeah.
You could go back and preen and polish till the cows come home. And, you might feel better about it from a obsessive compulsive
Yeah.
standpoint, but isn't the point to tell new stories and you're taking time away from that. So
Yeah. So much great information. Well, Frank,
I
if you're
hope
willing,
so.
this is definitely going to be a podcast episode
Okay.
because I just think you've shared lots of great lessons, both for readers, but for writers as well. So now that you've piqued everybody's interest in your work, please let them know where they can go to find out more about you and all your work online.
The easiest point right now is just to go to my website, frankzafiro.com. Everything's there that you need. All the books are laid out. There's a handy dandy little which book is for you sort of thing on the right hand column there. So if you like procedurals, there's River City or Charlie 316. If you like private investigators, there's Copriva or another one. Thrillers, hardboiled, whatever it is that you like, there's a series or two underneath each heading so you can know right where to start. But frankzafiro.com is the best place to get rolling.
Great. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Maddie. And I want to say thank you for all you do for writers. You put a lot of effort into promoting and supporting other writers with your Facebook page and this podcast and a myriad of other things that you do. And I know firsthand how much work that is. And so I think writers should be very grateful to you for the work you do. I think it's very selfless and you should be commended.
Well, thank you so much. What a nice thing to say. Thank you, Frank.
Well, I mean it. It's very true. A lot in today's world, a lot of people are understandably focused on promoting their own work all the time. That's what I'm doing here. But, it's a nice thing to see someone being so selfless. So good on you.
Thank you.